what distinguishes a natural object like a stone or a piece of wood or a reindeer antler from an artifact, like, say, a prehistoric stone tool or a carved wooden cup or an antler lasso toggle? Well, the usual answer is that in the artifact, a form that initially existed as an idea or a template in the maker's mind has been imposed on the originally shapeless raw material, or piece of stone, wood, or antler. In other words, the artifact is the materialization of a thought. And so in order to make something, you have first to think it, or to hold that thought at the forefront of your mind as you work with the material. And once the material has taken on the form intended for it, then, and only then, do you say that it is pili. And any changes to the form that take place beyond that point are attributed to the subsequent phase of use. Well, that's the traditionality, which I call meiji truth theory. In philosophy, it is better known as hylomorphism, that comes from the Greek word hyle, meaning matter, and the word morphe, meaning form. So to create an artifact, according to the hylomorphic model of making, is to project the form onto the material. I have the form, the idea into my head, I project it on the stone, wood, antler, and there it comes to be as a material object. And so the mental work, the theory, comes before its application or execution in practice. Or theory leads, practice follows, as indeed the very notion of application implies. So mating takes place, according to this view, mating takes place in the interval between a starting point and a finishing point. At the start, the maker is there with a lump of material in his hands and an idea in his head. And at the end, there he is, holding the complete artifact. But where is the creativity in this? To find it, we have to be backwards from a finished object to the ideas that gave rise to it. And it's this kind of backwards reading, that is the attribution of form to an unprecedented idea in the mind of a maker. It's that kind of backwards readings that underpins the very commonplace identification of creativity with innovation. We think that if anybody's being creative, he has to produce something new, which means that the object there is the realization of some idea that flashed into the maker's mind and had never occurred before. And of course, with that goes the idea that the production of traditional craft is inherently uncreative, unless it can be shown to incorporate some kind of novelty. Now, the trouble with this view is that it leaves out the creativity of the very processes wherein both things and ideas are generated. They're generated on the one hand in the flows and transformations of materials, and on the other hand in the movement of the imagination and of sensory awareness. The painter Paul Klee wrote in one of his notebooks, "Form is the end, death. Form making is life." So where is the creativity of the life process, of the processes wherein forms come into being? And I think to find it, we have to be creativity forwards rather than backwards. This is instead of starting from an object and thinking, what was the novel idea that gave rise to this object? So we read back from the object to the idea that was supposed to come before it. We read creativity forwards, and that means joining with the movements of materials and awareness as they feel their way ahead in real time. It's to joy with the movement of making. And such feeling forward is essentially a process of improvisation, finding one's way. And to find one's way, to improvise, is to think through making. In thinking through making, rather than making through thinking, nothing is ever finished. Every artifact is a way station on its way to something else. It might be the next artifact to be made in the series, or it might be that that artifact will go on in due course to become something else. And likewise, every thought is just a passing moment in a process of thinking that continually carries on. So the creativity of thinking through making lies in the improvisation rather than in innovation. Innovation, novelty has got nothing to do with it. I mean, for example, perhaps the most creative possible thing in the world, I think, that is to bring into being a new life, like a new baby. But would you say, wow, that's creative. Look, we haven't seen anything like that baby before. It's an innovation. It's nothing to do with that. It's about growth and about life. So the creativity lies in the improvisation, in the improvisatory nature of the processes, rather than in the novelty of more or less ephemeral products compared with what went before. So in thinking through making, we can no longer regard making as a projection, as the projection of a ready-made thought or concept onto raw material, or a projection of form on matter, as the traditional hylomorphic model of making proposes. Rather, making is an ongoing binding together of material flows and sensory awareness. And this is to think of making as a kind of weaving, if you like, and to think of every knot, every artifact, as something rather like a knot, something that's bound together of lots of materials that all get scrunched up together at some place here where they're tied up. That, incidentally, is why I don't use PowerPoint. There is a rationale for this. I don't believe in PowerPoint, because when we use PowerPoint, we project images on a screen. PowerPoint is the epitome of the logic of projection, which I'm arguing against. And the reason why I like blackboards is that the blackboard is the epitome of the process of creativity that I'm arguing for. When you stand at the blackboard and you scrape a line, then your movement, your awareness, the trace of the materials, all are bound up in that one performance. And what you see is the outcome of that performance. That's why I like blackboards and don't like PowerPoint. But anyway, we should think of the artifact then as a kind of knot binding together of materials that momentarily hangs together through piers. And the thought about a knot is that a knot, like we've knot together lots of lengths of string. The thing about the knot is it is not a bound up, it's not a bounded structure, but an open one. Because in a knot, every strand that is bound together in a knot is trailing off somewhere else, where it might get bound up with other things in other knots. And that, of course, is what happens in any process of weaving or articulating or anything like that. So to think of the artifact as a knot is to think of it in terms of the histories of the materials that make it up. And that has quite important implications to the way we think about the surfaces of things. Instead of thinking of the surface of an artifact as something in which it is contained, as though you had a wooden cup and you said the surfaces of that cup bind it up so that the cup is tied up within itself. We need to think of surfaces more as places in which there's a continual interchange between materials and the environment, between the solid stuff of the stone or the wood and the air that is surrounding it. And depending on the quality of that air, that surface might change its state. A wet stone looks quite different from a dry stone, for example. So this, if we think of artifacts in that way, then the craftsman, the maker, is somebody who has to follow the materials, who has to join his or her own life to the lives of the materials that they work with. So then we ask, but what are materials? What is wood? What is stone? What is antler? And it's a very hard question to answer, but I think for the maker, for the practitioner, materials are what they do. Materials are what happens when you work with them. And this is a perspective, an understanding of materials that is very similar to that of medieval alchemy and quite unlike that of natural science. The natural scientist wants to understand the fundamental properties of matter in terms of their atomic or molecular constitution. But the craftsman needs to understand materials in terms of what they do, what happens to you. If you do this or that, or work this way or that way, if you're working with wood, if you push your tool in this way, it will crack. If it turned that way, it will carve nicely. So the craftsman needs to understand materials in terms of what they do when you work with them. So the craftsman is also a kind of alchemist. And the properties of materials, which the craftsman has to understand, are not objectively measured, nor are they simply subjectively attributed. It's not that our minds just decide that we'll attribute this or that quality to wood or to stone. They are properties that are practically experienced. So a craftsman does not impose form on matter, but in a sense finds the grain of things and enters the grain and then bends the grain to his or her own evolving purpose. Okay, so thinking through making is a process of thinking, and therefore it generates knowledge of some kind. But then the question is, what kind of knowledge is this? What kind of knowledge is generated in the process of thinking through making? Now, normal science proceeds by setting out or engineering an encounter, such as in the laboratory or in the field, between ideas in the head, hypotheses generated on the basis of theory, and facts on the ground. We come up with ideas, we turn those ideas into hypotheses, we test them against the facts, revise our ideas to accord better with our experimental findings, and so on and on, in an endless process of what has been called conjecture and refutation. But that procedure, that standard procedure of science, is to place the knower and his or her knowledge outside of the worlds that he or she seeks to know. Making through thinking, in the manner of scientific experimentation, and in the design principles built on it, is, if you like, a way of knowing from the outside. It places the knower outside the world he or she wishes to know about. Thinking through making puts that relation in reverse. It's a way, I would claim, of knowing from inside. Here, knowledge is not created through an encounter between minds already furnished with concepts and a material world already populated with objects, but rather such knowledge grows from the crucible of our own practical and observational engagements with the materials, beings, and things all around us in the very processes of thought. So this is a knowledge that doesn't wrap things up from the outside, as it will take things and will enclose them with our knowledge, but rather it's kind of knowledge that grows from the inside of being in the unfolding of life. Now, I think that the problem with currently dominant ways of thinking in modern technoscience and in the kinds of policy making that depends on modern technoscience is that we got the relation between knowing and being the wrong way round. And that, I think, is why techno-scientifically driven policy continues to deliver solutions that are unsustainable. By sustainability here, I don't mean reaching some kind of steady state at which we could say we can take the world after this point, but not any further, so we must do everything to fix it there. Rather, by sustainability, I mean simply be able to carry on, to keep on going. Doesn't mean always doing the same things or being the same state, but it does mean being able to carry life on. And I think that a lot of the spaces for modern or contemporary policy making makes that increasingly difficult for people to carry on their lives. By placing knowing on the outside of being, or by wrapping things up in our own preconceptions and categorical frameworks, we close them up, leaving, in a sense, no room for growth. And by the same token, we cut knowing off from the immediacy of our own visceral sensory engagement with the world of our everyday lives. It sometimes seems that the more knowledgeable we become, the less attention we pay to what is going on around us in our environment. Sometimes I think that, for example, the science is telling us a lot about climate change these days, and we are not supposed to deny that climate change is happening, but the science does not encourage us to look very carefully at what's going on around us. It tells us that we should look at graphs and tables and databases and one thing and another, so that we don't actually notice that there's something awfully wrong with the population of bees. I don't know if the problem in here, but in Britain certainly, and in the United States, I think there is one chair in Britain, one academic chair devoted to the study of what's happening with bees. And this professor has a little bit of money to spend on finding what's going on. And yet these threaten the global food supply, probably, or the prices with these threatens the global food supply much more than anything that's happening with climate change at the moment. So just an example of the way in which an obsession with bee science can actually stop us from paying attention to what is actually going on underneath our very noses. It is we think we know, and if we think we know because we have the science, well, what further reason do we have to ask? Literally blinded by information and dazzled by images on screens like this, in lecture theaters which are darkened so we can't see what's going on outside around us, we fail to observe what is happening before our very eyes. Indeed, I would say that never in the history of the world has so much information been married to so little wisdom. We need to turn it around. And that, I think, is why we need art. And by art here, I'm including craft. I don't want to start worrying about the distinction between art and craft. That's usually an unhelpful thing to worry about. Of course, scientists nowadays really like art, and a lot of money is being spent on what they call sci-art, science art collaborations. Scientists like it because they think art gives a sexy way to dress up their findings and to give them a kind of human face. It's very nice if you're a scientist to be able to say, but look, the artists like to be, here's some pictures and so on. But we really need art, I think, to challenge the foundations of technoscience. That is, to reawaken our senses and to allow knowledge once again to grow from the inside so that it literally becomes part of who we are and part of how we relate to the world around us. So the thing about a work of art is not that it captures what has already come to pass and renders it back to the spectators, but rather that the work of art moves forward in real time, along with those who encounter it, and with the world to which both it and they belong. An artwork that becomes part of the world that we are all, the work itself is moving forward, and so are we, and so is the world. So far from answering to their plans and predictions, a work of art joined with them in their hopes and dreams. That is, I think, it enables us better to perceive the world and in turn to respond to it. That is, it sets up a relation between ourselves and the world that I think we might describe as one of correspondence or correspondence. It's as though we were kept in the old-fashioned way, sending letters to one another, corresponding with the world, having a conversation with it, in which each side is responding to the other. Now, when I suppose this could be regarded as an appeal to thinking as things in terms of their wholeness, but I'm not making an appeal for what managers and businessmen and politicians sometimes call joined up thinking. In fact, I think joined up thinking is a very bad thing, because in a world that is fully joined up, there is absolutely no room left for life or imagination. Where does this go? Suppose you have everything in the world and you connected it all up into some grand network, and you say, look, this is holistic thinking, this is interdisciplinary, we have put everything together, we have assembled a jigsaw. What then? There is no room left to do anything. So the crucial thing is that we should not join the world up, that we should have lots of loose ends in which everything is a knot with ends trailing off in all sorts of directions that can then be followed and taken further. And that's why I like to think of the world not as a network where everything is a particular node and we draw the lines connecting them all up, but what I've been calling a meshwork, where everything is a line and the lines all get tangled up together, but no line has a beginning or an end. And those lines are the lives of ourselves, of other creatures, of the things around us. So there is room for life and imagination because the meshwork is a tangle in which everything, every line is, as it were, has a loose end that we can then follow and take further. So to think through making is, in effect, to participate in the weave of the meshwork. It's to pick up one of those lines, or several of them, and take them further. But just as a last observation, even if we talk about thinking through making, thinking does have a habit of running ahead of making. And perhaps it's just as well that it does. There is a degree to which we're not just feeling our way forward, but in which our actions are being pulled from in front. And our imagination runs ahead of what we do. And yet, when we're working with materials close up, there's a limit to how fast we can move. Working with materials have their own friction, their own drag. They hold us back. So when you're working with materials as a craftsperson or as an artist, you have to work slowly. And yet the imagination is always pulling us off ahead into the distance. And I think that the real skill, the real trick, of craftsmanship is that the really skilled craftsman is one who can hold the forward-moving momentum of imagination that's always running off into the distance, hold that in check with the slow movement of working with materials. You can look into the distance and be close up at the same time. It's, as sometimes says, for example, of painters, that they can't actually see what they paint, because in order to work on the canvas, you're holding a brush, you have to have the canvas fairly close by, but in order to see what you're painting, you have to stand some way back. So the painter is somebody who's able to hold close to the material, whilst at the same time be able to think from a distance. And it's the same with composing music. Composing music would be easy if it weren't for the fact that it can take an hour to notate a passage that in performance would take maybe only a minute. So that the composer is somehow able to hold to that little bit that he's working on, whilst keeping in mind the longer term the overall movement of the work. I think it is the same with any kind of art or any kind of craft, that indeed of human life in general, that there is a tension between the reach of the imagination that always wants to pull off into the distance and a drag of material that is always holding us back. And we are somehow caught in the middle of that. And the art of the maker who thinks through making then is to keep his or her eyes trained on the far horizon while still engaged in the labors of proximity. Thank you.